You know what I love about chapter 35 is it comes right before chapter 36. We're there, folks. At the end of the road, final stretch. Let's finish strong. We've got three things to accomplish in this chapter. We've looked at me verbs in the indicative, so now we look at me verbs in the non-indicative. We look at the fourth and final of the Greek moods, called the optative, and we look further at conditional sentences. So here are our key terms: the optative mood, and two more kinds of condition, first class and second class. Now, we don't need to run through the various parts on how to form the subjunctive because this is going to be very similar to what you've done with the subjunctive before. We don't need to run through every one of these forms either. So very quickly, we can say, once again, that with subjunctive verbs, you lengthen the vowel that you would have seen in the indicative. Didomi is a little bit special because since it's an omicron class verb, it ends up becoming omega every time because omega is supreme. So we get that lengthened vowel all the way through. The second thing to remember about subjunctives is that they always use primary endings, never secondary endings, even in the aorist. So the aorist also will use the lengthened connecting vowel, but primary personal endings. The imperative of didomi. You still have your characteristic to, te, tosan. Remember, it's that second person singular form that for each of the imperatives is the difficult one. So here did do, looks a little funny. And in the aorist, you still have your to, te, tosan, but it's the second person singular that looks a little funny. So you'll just have to work with it, write these out over and over and over and over again. So same for the infinitives. Without belaboring this, you're just going to have to work with it, memorize it, write it out, grade yourself, check it, do it again until you've got them perfect. In general, these are like the infinitive forms you've seen already, but as you look through, you'll notice some differences from non-me verbs. Participles of didomi, again, largely similar to what you've done before, with just slight differences. So you notice in the nominative singular, for example, something funny is going on here. You've got your participial morpheme, nu ta, but this time, look, they do use that case ending in the nominative participle. We're in the third declension for the masculine, so sasia as oncias. You see your os and the genitive. So what happens because we have a nu ta followed by a sigma in the nominative? Nu ta followed by sigma drops. And when that happens, the word begins to feel inadequate, small. And so it hits the gem, it works out, and it develops pectoral diphthong that's just a little bit lopsided. So you end up with deduce there. And in the neuter, we of course have no ending in the nominative, and a ta at the end of the word drops, and that's how you end up with didon. We reach now the fourth and final of the Greek moods. What are the four? The indicative, which is the mood of fact or reality. The subjunctive, which is the mood of possibility or the hypothetical. The imperative, which is the mood of command. And now finally the optative. The optative is the mood of wish. So it's even further removed from reality than the subjunctive is. It's the most remote from reality. It's very infrequent in the New Testament. It occurs less than 100 times. And of those occurrences, most of them come in Luke and Acts and in Paul. And in Paul, about half of his occurrences come in the phrase me genoita, which means let it never be. May it never be. Some translations say God forbid. It's kind of paraphrase. So for example, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Me genoita, let it never be. So formation of the optative is maybe a little bit tricky. You have your stem, you have your connecting vowel omicron, and then it's this iota here that tells you it's optative, what we call the optative suffix. And then it's going to use secondary personal endings. So whereas the subjunctive always uses primary endings, even in the aorist, the optative is always going to use secondary endings, even in the present. So we have here the secondary active personal endings, but we also have a strange ending in the first singular. It uses me, although you see it does not use me endings throughout the rest. So the present middle passive will be the same. We're going to use our secondary middle passive personal endings, main sa ta, methus that nta. Of course, losing our intervocalic sigma in the second person singular. Okay, so we have our four moods, the indicative, subjunctive, optative, and imperative, and then we have our verbals, participles, and infinitives. So this summarizes which tenses exist in each mood and each kind of verbal. So only in the indicative do we have the 6 tenses plus that future perfect that's formed periphrastically. For the rest, it's generally present and aorist. And then for some of them, you have frequent perfects or um, in other cases, infrequent perfects. And then many of these tenses do exist in the Greek language but are unattested in the New Testament. Okay, so let's review the difference between the four moods and then these other two verbals, infinitives and participles. The moods involve finite verbs. A finite verb is a verb that finishes a thought. It is a complete thought if it has a verb in one of the moods in it. Whereas non-finite verbals are not technically verbs because they do not finish a thought. And the classic example is the infinitive. It's non-finite, unfinite. So to show you what I mean by finished thought, if you look at the examples in the left-hand column, I freed the girl. That's a complete thought using an indicative verb. The second example, I should free the girl. That's a complete thought using what could be a subjunctive. And the third, free the girl, complete thought using an imperative. And then finally, would that I could free the girl. That would use the optative if we put it into Greek, and it's a complete thought. Contrast that with the examples on the right. To free the girl. We have to free. That is not a verb, though, because it is not finite. It's what we call a verbal. An infinitive is a verbal noun, so it's not really a verb. And likewise, the second example, freeing the girl, we have a participle. It's a verbal, but it's not a verb because it does not finish the thought. It does not complete the thought. Neither to free the girl nor freeing the girl is a complete or finished thought. Every clause must have a verb. Finally, conditionals. So the structure of a conditional sentence is quite simple. You have an if clause and you have a then clause, but the fancy pants words for those are protasis, that is the before part, the if part, and apodosis, the then clause. So, for example, if you build it, protasis, they will come, apodosis. In Greek, conditionals are usually classified in 4 classes. We've seen the third class condition. This is the one that uses aon at the beginning. Aon means if, and aon will be followed by a verb in the subjunctive mood. The fourth class condition does not occur in the New Testament. You have partial fourth class conditions using only a protasis, for example, but you don't have any complete ones, so easy enough. The first class condition is very frequent. This kind of condition assumes that the protasis is true for the sake of argument. So sometimes called the simple fact condition. So if we say, ehe dexia su ker skandalidze se, ekapsan altain, we have now A introducing the condition. So the first class condition is not introduced with aon, but A, and does not use the subjunctive verb, but uses an indicative verb. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. So what's different in the first class condition is that the protasis, if your right hand causes you to stumble, we're saying we can treat this contingency as a real contingency for the sake of argument. And that becomes the condition for the conclusion, cut it off. That's different from the second class condition, and that the second class condition assumes that the process is false for the sake of argument. So it can be called the contrary to fact condition. It will still be introduced with A, and it will use an indicative verb, but it will be an indicative verb in a past tense, either the imperfect or the aorist. So here we have, for if they had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So we see that the premise is considered false for the sake of argument. If they had known it, and what's implied is that they didn't know it. If they had known it, and you could almost put in parentheses, and they didn't, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So Mounts includes in the text a nice summary chart of the four classes and how each of them is formed. Okay, chapter 35 does not include any vocabulary, but I'm not going to let you off that easy. We need to continue building your vocabulary. Mounts' textbook gives you just over 300 words, and that's great because now you know about 80% of the words on the pages of the New Testament. However, there's over 5,000 different words used in the New Testament. You need to continue to build, a little bit at a time. Rome wasn't built in a day, neither is your Greek vocabulary. There's a maxim for today. So here's 15 more words for you to learn. Repeat after me. Hagiadzo, hamartano, hamartolos, anastasis, apangelo, diakoneo, diakonia, dikaiao, thlipsis, hilasterion, staurao, soter, soteria, phanerao, phobos.